Close to 14,000 refugees in Indonesia, around half of those from Afghanistan, are marking a 10-year wait for resettlement into other countries, including Australia, with protests and pleas for help. Refugees in Indonesia are unable to receive an education, obtain working rights to support their families overseas or to get a driver's licence. Now, advocates and the Refugee Council of Australia are calling on the federal government to consider a policy reset to let some of those refugees into the country.
In Indonesia, it's not just storms buffeting the lives of these Hazara refugees inside this makeshift camp, but the batons of Indonesian police lines too, moving the refugees on as they protest outside UN offices across the country. Thousands of refugees are marking their 10-year wait for resettlement into other countries, including the United States and Canada, through increasingly desperate pleas.
We are suffering here. We have been experiencing uncertainty and living in limbo for about 7 to 10 years.
Muhammad Juma, a Hazara refugee, is organising one of the protests outside UN buildings in Sumatra.
We cannot forget 15 refugees have committed suicide. Some have died, some have attempted suicide but unfortunately failed. And many are suffering from mental sickness.
Refugees have been sewing their lips in protest. In one case, a man self-immolated in footage too graphic to show as part of what has been described as a mental health crisis by refugee advocates. In 2014, then Immigration Minister, now Prime Minister Scott Morrison, enacted a policy of barring any refugee requests made from Indonesia to stop asylum seekers using it as a transit country to Australia. The Refugee Council of Australia says the federal government has a duty to reconsider that policy and resettle some of those refugees, with Afghanistan in turmoil after the Taliban takeover and the withdrawal of coalition forces.
People cannot go home, they cannot remain where they are, and they have nowhere to go to, really stuck in limbo. And Australia, has done more than any other country to exacerbate this situation.
Refugees who've settled in Australia say their friends and family are suffering in limbo.
The only option for these refugees are to wait and to sit and wait for resettlement, but the opportunity for resettlement is extremely lengthy, and therefore they face prolonged uncertainty.
The Department for Home Affairs says its border policies remain steadfast and that people who travel to Australia by boat as asylum seekers will not settle permanently here.
I am kindly asking the Australian brother and sister and the Australian government, please open your heart for our refugees, brother and sister in Indonesia.
Meanwhile, Muhammad Juma and thousands of fellow refugees will continue to protest outside the walls of UN offices in the hopes foreign governments will listen. Henry Zwartz, SBS World News.